History is often about answering questions from our past. My own family history has always been a mystery to me. Although born in China and with Asian features, my mother doesn't speak a word of Chinese, nor has she any knowledge of her culture of birth. Instead, she comes from Mexico, a place with almost no Chinese at all. Quite a contrast with the large Chinese communities in other American countries. Why had my mom's family lost all links to China? How did some Chinese ended up in Mexico 150 years ago and then vanished? None of this made any sense, instead leaving me with the impression that my family was like a lost Chinese tribe. When I was a child, my mother gave me some partial answers, like how she had lost her Chinese father when she was 3 years old, forced to flee China from Mexico because of the war, or how her Chinese grandfather on her mother's side, one of the early migrants to the Americas, had forbidden his children to learn Chinese because he wanted to avoid them taking the bad habits of the migrants, like gambling or smoking. This girl in the photograph is my mother. The year is 1938. She's on her boat from China to Mexico, having just lost her father, her country and her home. She's a refugee, fearful of what other calamities may still fall upon her. I've held those questions for years until I've decided to dive into some old family documents and start reading about the history of the early Chinese migrants in America. I was so intrigued by what I found that I decided to quit my job and feeling compelled to write about what I was uncovering. At first, I was full of self-doubts. Would anyone be interested in those stories? Could they be representative of something bigger? And more importantly, how to gather those scattered family memories and turn them into a comprehensive narrative. I'm no professional historian. Instead, I've worked all my life in business, a career which brought me to China, where I've worked for almost 15 years, learning the language that my mother never learned herself. However, since a young age, I've always loved history books, especially those with powerful and touching human narratives. My initial investigation provided answers to most of my questions. China, 200 years ago, was a dangerous place, nothing like today. It was rife with feudal violence, banditry, famines, and rebellions. People were so destitute that they sometimes sold their children, or, in the case of my family, sent them abroad as laborers. My ancestors fleeing this poverty were among the first migrants to the United States. This was before the US Congress enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first legislation of its kind, prohibiting Chinese immigration, turning the USA into a nation of gatekeepers and its Chinese into its first illegal immigrants. Before the act, the Chinese had already been singled out, banned, amongst other things, from marrying white women, from buying land, or from becoming citizens. Those laws would be in place for almost 100 years, preventing much dialogue between those two races, and soon were followed by anti-Chinese riots, expulsions, and killings. Because of the invention of the steam engine, the 19th century saw for the first time mass migration on all its continents. Ordinary Chinese and Americans were meeting for the first time, creating a clash of cultures and a sense of alienation never experienced before, yet giving also those migrants, for the first time, dreams of their own. In the 1880s, pushed by that violence in the United States, my ancestors sought refuge in Mexico, a country which at first welcomed them. Mexico seemed a heaven for them, being able to do all those things they were not allowed to do in the United States, such as marrying or buying land. And many became quite prosperous in their new land. My ancestors built a Chinese colony, one like no other before in America, one with its own banks, stores, schools, hotels, even with a tramway company. This photograph shows my grandmother in 1909, 3 years old. She's on the left corner of the photograph with a white ribbon on her head. It shows her mixed, confident, and prosperous family. Yet, because of those successes, these immigrants soon suffered from resentment, and they too soon became victims of anti-Chinese movements, exclusion, racial laws, and killings. Some even worse than in the United States 40 years earlier, including the largest massacre of Chinese in American history, when in less than 2 days, more than 300 Chinese were killed in a northern town by a mob of 4,000 people, destroying their Chinese colony. Sadly, this was 1911. Sadly, if fascism was spreading in Europe, it had reached Mexico too. This other photograph shows the same family, but 6 years later. My grandmother is still on the bottom left corner of the photograph, and still with some white ribbons on her head. But notice the changed expressions of all my family members. Instead of the confidence of 6 years earlier, they're all showing now either anger or disbelief in front of what's happening to them. As a result, out of the 60,000 Chinese who had entered Mexico at the start of the century, by 1940, only 5,000 remained. And those were traumatized, doing everything they could to blend in and forget both their history and their origins. Yet, strangely, those migrants remain optimists. That was the only way for them to survive. And for that reason, they believe that those massacres will never happen again, hence making those memories superfluous. With the witnesses dead decades ago and no common memory left, I had to find historical documents to tell the story, ones which, like pieces of an old puzzle, would, little by little, form a clear picture again. In my case, and when it came to Mexican politicians, there was only one official narrative, only painting them as national heroes, never critical of them. My challenge became to find unbiased historical sources, one which forcing me to dig into archives to find dissenting narratives, one which would show the real political violence of those days. Sadly, I was now conducting my research in places where journalists are still murdered today, perpetuating the same violence and truth hiding from the past. I now understood why my ancestors had been forced into exile so many times, and the real reasons for my great-grandfather to forbid his children to learn the Chinese language. Yet, the more I learned, the more disturbing questions came to my mind. Why, of all nations, had the Chinese been singled out in the United States? Why had they been accepted in Mexico and then pushed, which even further violence than in the north? How had my ancestors managed to survive? And more importantly, how could massacres of Chinese happen in Mexico, a place which is known to be tolerant and victim of racism itself? Could victims become bullies as well? A simple narrative was starting to emerge. One where hardworking Chinese migrants had been at clash with a white majority which saw them as dangerous competitors. As I found out, that pattern of violence had repeated itself over centuries and continents. Mass massacres of Chinese migrants can be traced back to the Philippines in the 18th century, to Peru and the US in the 19th, and to Mexico and various Southeast Asian countries in the 20th. Yet, I struggled to understand, other than race and power, what other reasons had caused those massacres? What aspects of Chinese culture 100 years ago had made the Chinese so hated by the white majority? Why did people 100 years ago said that Chinese and Americans could never live together because they were so fundamentally different? Could the Chinese have been, even in a small way, partly responsible for some of their misfortunes in the New World? Unlike fiction, writing a book about history came with responsibility. Responsibility towards the readers, but also towards the characters I was portraying. Writing a family memoir, I knew total objectivity would be difficult to achieve, yet I wanted to avoid a one-sided narrative. Maybe it helped that I saw myself as a product of that history, my early years in Mexico, then studying in Europe, and finally working many years in the US and China. Reflecting on my journey, I believe that history does not have to be the exclusive domain of teachers or historians, but instead that it belongs to us all. At a time when books are still banned in many countries, and other countries continue to be ignorant of their history, either purposely distorting or hiding it, it is everyone's responsibility to learn and share historical narratives, or even in my case, to record them if those can complement more mainstream views. This can just only start by talking with an old relative or uncovering old and forgotten history books. If there is one advice I would like to give to the young audience today, is go speak with your older relatives. You might uncover some interesting and worth-telling stories too. One thing I regret today is not having spoken with my grandparents enough when they were alive. One defining moment in my life and behind my journey today is a school-sponsored trip I did to Auschwitz more than 30 years ago. I'm still moved today by the words that a survivor told us with tears in her eyes. It was the first, now she was an old lady, it was the first time she was going back to the place where she had seen all her families murdered when she was a little girl almost 50 years earlier. She told me that day the importance of remembrance. Why is this history, this shared social history between China, the US, and Mexico still relevant today? Because this history continues and dialogue continues between those three nations, one that has become important for world peace. This history shows biases from all sides and the dangers of exclusion. Only by learning and acknowledging our past with both its failures and successes can nations become not only wiser, but stronger, and also being able to build more compassionate and accepting societies. As an historian put it, we're all historical beings. We love to tell stories about our past. Yet, some of those stories can have historical consequences themselves. History does not have to be about victimization, anger, or guilt, but instead about showing our shared humanity and common heritage, and ultimately brings us closer. Thank you.